Hello. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the kitchen as Henry hummed quietly, flipping bacon in the skillet. Today was a special day. It was his 43rd wedding anniversary with Linda. Mornings like this had always been sacred to Henry. He took comfort in the simple routine of making breakfast, a tradition he had kept for as long as he could remember. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the kitchen, blending with the quiet memories of decades together. Linda entered the kitchen, her usual bright smile only reaching halfway to her eyes. She leaned in to give Henry a quick peck on the cheek, murmuring a soft, "Thank you," as she settled into her seat. But something about her seemed distant. Henry noticed the slight furrow in her brow, her gaze slipping away as if she were lost in thought. She toyed absently with her coffee cup, her fingers tapping in a pattern he didn't recognize. "Big day today, huh?" he said, trying to sound upbeat as he began plating breakfast. "I thought we could go to that new Italian place in town tonight. Celebrate, you know." Linda looked up, her expression unreadable. She hesitated, setting down her fork before replying, "Oh, Henry. I meant to tell you. I have a work meeting tonight that I really can't miss." Her voice was tinged with regret but carried an edge of something else, something he couldn't quite place. His heart sank, but he forced a smile, trying to mask his disappointment. "That's all right, Linda," he replied, struggling to keep his voice light. "We can always celebrate this weekend." Her smile returned, a little relieved, as if she'd expected a bigger reaction from him. She excused herself shortly after, leaving her breakfast barely touched, and retreated to the bedroom to get ready. Henry stood alone in the kitchen, his own appetite fading as a creeping unease settled over him. Over the past few weeks, Henry had noticed subtle changes in Linda's behavior: late nights, missed dinners, an unexplained coldness that seeped into their conversations. He wanted to trust her as he always had, to brush off the changes as a temporary phase, but there was a small voice in the back of his mind that wouldn't quiet. Something was off, something more than work stress, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could ignore it. The days after their anniversary only deepened Henry's sense of isolation. Linda's excuses about late work meetings became more frequent, each one eroding the bond they'd spent decades building. She'd return home hours after dark, slipping in quietly, often assuming he was already asleep. Henry would lie awake, pretending to be asleep but fully aware of every sound, each creak of the floorboards as she moved through the house like a stranger. At breakfast, he'd try to ask about her work, gently probing to see if she'd offer any details about these mysterious late nights. But each question was met with a quick, evasive response or a change of subject. It was as if she'd built a wall between them, one he couldn't break through. The woman who had once shared every aspect of her life with him now seemed like a distant stranger, someone who was slipping away from him piece by piece. One morning, as they sat in strained silence over breakfast, he reached for her hand, hoping for some warmth, some sign that they were still connected. But she pulled her hand back almost reflexively, mumbling something about needing to get to work early. The coldness of that gesture hit him harder than he'd anticipated. He watched as she gathered her things, barely looking at him as she hurried out the door. Once she was gone, Henry sat alone at the table, staring at her empty plate. He felt like he was losing her, but he couldn't figure out why. They'd faced ups and downs before, tough years when raising the kids or dealing with financial worries had strained their relationship. But this time felt different. There was no visible struggle, no reason he could find for her growing distance. It was a silence he couldn't penetrate, a chasm he couldn't bridge. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Henry decided to call Diane, Linda's sister. Diane had always been close with both of them, and he hoped she might offer some insight. But when he finally worked up the courage to reach out, she sounded as surprised as he was. "Linda hasn't mentioned anything to me, Henry. Are you sure it's not just work stress?" Her words did little to reassure him, leaving him with more questions than answers. Maybe it was work stress, he thought. Maybe he was reading too much into things. But deep down, Henry knew that something fundamental had shifted. and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the weight of that realization settled heavy in his chest. Every night that she came home late, every breakfast spent in silence chipped away at his hope, leaving him with the unshakable feeling that his marriage was unraveling, one quiet moment at a time. As the weeks passed, Henry's unease grew into something darker, a creeping suspicion that gnawed at him day and night. He became hyper-aware of Linda's every action, watching for signs, patterns, anything that might explain her coldness. It was in the way she lingered over her phone, quickly setting it down when he entered the room. Or how she spent hours on end outside the house, only to return with vague excuses that made less and less sense. One evening, she mentioned a work trip. "It's last minute," she said, barely meeting his gaze as she packed her bag. "The team's heading out of town for a few days. I'll be back by the weekend." She spoke with the same distance that had become all too familiar, her tone flat and almost rehearsed. Henry watched her, a pit forming in his stomach. They'd spent years together, and he could read her better than anyone, or at least, he thought he could. But now, it felt like she was hiding behind a mask, one that revealed nothing of the woman he'd loved for so long. He swallowed his concerns, watching her pack in silence, but a thought lingered at the back of his mind, stubborn and unshakable. Was she really going on a work trip, or was there something more she wasn't telling him? The following morning, she left before dawn, offering him a distracted goodbye before disappearing into the early light. The house felt empty without her, a hollow echo of what their home had once been. Henry tried to go about his day as usual, tending to his garden, running errands, but the emptiness weighed on him. His thoughts kept circling back to her, wondering if he'd ever truly known her at all. On a whim, he decided to call her office, something he hadn't done in years. The receptionist was polite but surprised to hear from him. "Linda isn't scheduled for any trips this week," she informed him, sounding genuinely confused. "She's been working from home on a few projects." Henry's heart sank. The realization hit him like a wave, leaving him struggling to keep his composure. She had lied, there was no work trip, no business emergency. She was somewhere else, somewhere she didn't want him to know about. His mind raced, grasping at explanations, each one worse than the last. But with every excuse he came up with, the painful truth settled deeper into his heart. For the rest of the day, he replayed their conversations, searching for clues he might have missed, signs that had been there all along. It felt like his world was splintering, the life they'd built unraveling thread by thread. And for the first time in their decades together, Henry felt the cold weight of betrayal, the sting of a secret kept far too long. As he sat alone in the empty house, he realized that he could no longer ignore the truth. He had to confront her, to demand answers, even if it meant facing a reality he wasn't ready to accept. The lie about the work trip left Henry feeling like a stranger in his own life. After 43 years of marriage, he'd never imagined he'd have to question Linda's loyalty. But her secrecy, her distance, the outright lies, he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He needed the truth, and he knew the only way to get it was to see it for himself. A few days later, Linda told him she'd be working late, her voice casual, almost too rehearsed. Henry pretended to take it in stride, nodding as she slipped out the door with the same detached farewell he'd grown used to. But this time, as soon as she left, he grabbed his car keys and followed her. He kept a few car lengths behind, trying to keep his distance as he watched her take an unfamiliar route. She was driving carefully, making turns here and there as if she were deliberately avoiding any direct paths. Henry's hands gripped the wheel, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't silence. When she finally pulled into a small, quiet neighborhood on the other side of town, he felt a sharp pang in his chest. Henry parked at a distance, watching as Linda got out of the car and walked up to a modest, single-story house. She knocked, and the door opened. A man he didn't recognize greeted her, leaning in for a kiss that she returned without hesitation. They lingered in the doorway, wrapped in a familiarity that left Henry feeling hollow. Every doubt, every fear he'd suppressed over the last few weeks became painfully real in that single moment. He couldn't look away, each second searing itself into his memory. He felt like an intruder, peering into a world he'd never been meant to see, a life that Linda had built without him. The realization settled over him, bitter and suffocating: their marriage, the life they'd shared, had been cast aside for someone else. After a few minutes, they disappeared inside, leaving Henry alone in the dim light of the street. He sat in his car, numb, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. The woman he'd loved, the one he'd shared his entire life with, had given herself to someone else. He wanted to march up to that door, to demand answers, but he knew that confrontation would only deepen the wound. This wasn't the kind of truth that could be reasoned away, it was a betrayal that would leave scars. Eventually, he started the car and drove back home in silence, each mile bringing him further from the life he thought he knew. By the time he walked through his front door, he felt like a different man, one who had left the best parts of himself somewhere on that quiet street, staring at a truth he'd never wanted to face. The hours dragged painfully by as Henry waited for Linda to return home that night. He paced the living room, glancing at the clock, feeling the weight of his anger and heartbreak building with each passing minute. When he finally heard the soft creak of the front door opening, he steeled himself, determined to confront her and end the charade once and for all. Linda walked in, her usual composure intact, but she froze when she saw him waiting. There was a tension in her face, a flicker of guilt that confirmed everything Henry already knew. She closed the door slowly, as if buying herself a few precious seconds before the inevitable confrontation. "Where were you tonight, Linda?" His voice was quiet but firm, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. She hesitated, a forced calmness in her voice as she replied, "I told you, I had a late meeting." He nodded, almost as if agreeing with her. "A meeting, with the man whose house you visited tonight? The man you kissed at the door?" Her face drained of color, and for a moment, she looked as if she might try to deny it. But Henry's steady gaze left her no room for pretense. She dropped her eyes, the weight of her betrayal settling over her like a shadow. "I'm sorry, Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want you to find out this way." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This way? And what way did you want me to find out, Linda? After 43 years, was I supposed to just accept that my wife found someone else without question?" Her eyes flickered with a mix of regret and defensiveness. "It just happened," she said, her voice wavering. "We've been distant for a long time, Henry. You have to admit that things haven't been the same between us." His anger flared. "So, instead of talking to me, instead of trying to work through it, you chose to lie and go behind my back. Was this your idea of saving us?" She glanced away, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The betrayal, the lies, the years they'd spent together, all of it felt meaningless in the face of her deception. He realized, painfully, that he had been fighting to preserve something that she had already cast aside. Henry's voice softened, a trace of resignation slipping in. "If you were unhappy, Linda, if you wanted something different, you could have told me. We could have done this with some dignity. Instead, you left me to find out on my own, like a stranger in my own life." Her face crumpled, tears filling her eyes, but he no longer felt the urge to comfort her. The woman he had loved, the woman he thought he knew, was a stranger now, someone he couldn't reconcile with the person standing before him. With a heavy heart, he turned and walked toward the door. "I need some time to think," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what this means for us, if there's even an us left." He left her standing in the living room, the weight of their shattered marriage hanging heavily between them. As he stepped outside, he felt a strange mixture of grief and relief, knowing he could finally start facing the truth, painful as it was. The days after the confrontation felt hollow, each one stretching endlessly as Henry tried to come to terms with Linda's betrayal. The house felt empty, memories lingering like ghosts in every corner. He couldn't bring himself to face Linda again, and he spent most of his time alone, drowning in questions he couldn't answer. But as the days turned to weeks, he realized he couldn't go on like this. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could help him process the pain. In a moment of vulnerability, he reached out to Diane, Linda's sister. Diane had always been a steady presence in their lives, someone who could see through the noise and get to the heart of things. He invited her over, unsure of what he'd say but hoping she'd understand. When she arrived, Diane took one look at him and immediately knew the weight he was carrying. She hugged him tightly, offering a quiet comfort he hadn't felt since the night he'd found out. As they settled in the living room, Henry took a deep breath, sharing everything he'd been holding in, the lies, the nights he'd spent awake wondering, the confrontation he'd never wanted to have. Diane listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from sorrow to anger and finally to empathy. When he finished, she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Henry," she said softly, "you didn't deserve this. I'm so sorry she hurt you this way." He nodded, the emotions he'd been bottling up finally starting to surface. "I keep asking myself why, Diane. Why did she throw away everything we built together? Was it something I did? Was I not enough?" Diane shook her head firmly. "You gave her everything, Henry. This isn't about you or what you did wrong. Some people, they get lost, they forget what really matters. But that's not your fault." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You have every right to be angry, to feel betrayed. But you also have a choice now, to keep carrying this weight, or to let it go and start fresh." Her words lingered, offering him a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. The idea of moving forward without the pain, of finding a way to rebuild his life, was daunting, but for the first time, it felt possible. Talking to Diane helped him realize that his life wasn't over because of Linda's choices. He still had strength left in him, strength to face whatever came next. They talked late into the evening, sharing memories and laughter amid the sorrow. By the time she left, Henry felt a weight lifted from his chest. He wasn't alone in this, he had people who cared, who wanted to see him heal. And as he closed the door, he knew that, somehow, he'd find a way through this. After his conversation with Diane, something shifted in Henry. He realized that he didn't have to let Linda's betrayal define him or dictate his future. He'd spent years building a life alongside her, but he wasn't ready to let her choices take away his dignity. Slowly, he began to take steps to regain his independence. The first thing he did was reorganize the house. It had become a place weighed down by memories, and every corner reminded him of their life together. He moved furniture, packed away photos, and even repainted the walls. Small changes, but each one felt like reclaiming a part of himself. With every box packed and every frame taken down, he felt a little more in control, a little more himself. Next, he reached out to old friends he hadn't spoken to in years, people he'd lost touch with during his years of marriage. The conversations felt a bit awkward at first, but the familiarity and warmth quickly returned, bringing a comfort he hadn't expected. His friends listened, shared their own stories of resilience, and encouraged him to keep moving forward. Their support reminded him that there was a life outside of his marriage, a world he could still be a part of. He also began visiting places he'd always loved but had stopped going to over the years. He'd always had a love for fishing, a pastime he'd once shared with his father, and being back by the water brought him a peace he'd nearly forgotten. The calm of the lake, the stillness of the mornings, each moment by the water reminded him that he was capable of finding joy on his own. As he settled into this new routine, Henry felt a quiet strength growing inside him. The grief and betrayal still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. He'd learned to set boundaries with Linda, keeping their interactions brief and necessary. With every day that passed, he felt himself moving further from the pain and closer to a life of his own making. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, he realized something profound. He was no longer waiting for Linda to return or for an apology that would never come. Instead, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. He had reclaimed his independence, his dignity, and his hope. And in doing so, he felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. As the weeks turned into months, Henry settled into a life that was entirely his own. The wounds from Linda's betrayal had healed slowly, leaving behind scars that reminded him of what he had endured, and how he had overcome it. He no longer felt like a stranger in his own home, he had made it a sanctuary, filled with warmth, simplicity, and the freedom to do things his way. One afternoon, Diane came by to visit, her face lighting up as she saw the changes Henry had made. "This place feels so, you," she said with a smile, glancing around at the cozy furniture, the photos of friends and family, and the fishing rods by the door. "It's like you're really here again." Henry nodded, a genuine smile crossing his face. "I feel like I finally am. It took a while, but I'm here now." They shared a quiet moment, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes with deep understanding. Diane squeezed his hand, her pride for him clear. "You deserve every bit of this happiness, Henry. I hope you know that." In the following weeks, Henry found himself exploring new hobbies, taking up photography, and even joining a local fishing club where he met others who shared his love for the outdoors. His days were filled with purpose, each one a reminder of the life he'd reclaimed. He no longer felt the weight of Linda's choices, instead, he felt the freedom of his own. One crisp autumn morning, Henry drove out to the lake by himself. The water was calm, reflecting the clear sky, and he felt a sense of peace as he cast his line. As he waited, he looked out over the water, realizing how far he had come from the man he'd been months ago. He had faced the darkness, embraced the pain, and emerged on the other side stronger, wiser, and fully in control of his future. In that moment, he understood that happiness wasn't about who stood beside him or the promises made in the past. It was about finding peace within himself, building a life that he could be proud of, and knowing that he was enough on his own. As he felt the tug of a fish on the line, Henry smiled, feeling a quiet joy ripple through him. This was his life, his beginning, and for the first time in a long time, he felt complete. Bye-bye.